Story Time with Stephanie Storey.
Welcome to Story Time. My name is Stephanie Storey, and my guest today is the author of First Come Marriage, My Not So Typical American Love Story. It is the story of this Iraqi-American author's courtship and marriage, what we might call an arranged marriage, although I know she has understandable issue with that phrase, which we will get to. I'm very excited for this conversation. Welcome to the show, Huda Al-Marashi.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie.
It's a fascinating time to have this conversation about marriage and courtship and relationships and what all of that means in the middle of this pandemic. So I'm very excited to get to that. But before we do, how do you think of your marriage?
Right. So First Comes Marriage tells the story of my marriage to the son of our closest family friends. We met when I was 6 years old and he was 9, and our parents were both Iraqi immigrants. This was early 1980s California. Back then, to meet somebody who spoke the same language as you, who came from the same country, who knew some of the same people, it was an exciting discovery. The families got introduced and we just met. We just, met as acquaintances that day. And it was the beginning of a family friendship. Now, because the population of people that kind of matched us and checked all the boxes was small, this question of marriage kind of always hung in the distance. Like, wouldn't it be great if these two got married in the future? And I think that's something that a lot of families do, that whole, wouldn't it be great if our kids one day got together? But because of the cultural background that we come from, we are a kind of matchmaking culture, a matchmaking community. As an American girl who had been born in the US, this question kind of hovered in the distance for me. After we did get married, had my marriage in fact been arranged? It was a question that I was even asking myself, and something that I wanted to tease apart in the book. We see modern society is playing with this idea all the time now, not just with these television shows like Love is Blind or The Bachelor or Married by America, but we have all these dating apps that are really doing what the aunties had done for generations for us, which is calling people's pictures, getting details about them, introducing people through that. And the thing is that why is it problematic? Why would I even care? Is the arranged marriage stereotype is very burdensome, I think, for young Muslim Americans, or even, I've been talking to a lot of Indian Americans through this book, and it's something that we are striving to live down. It's a burdensome stereotype. It's associated with a lack of love. It's kind of pitiful, right, in the American viewpoint, that you didn't love who you married. And that was the really important to me to challenge, to tease apart, why, to show my character wrestling with that, to show my character wrestling with that stereotype of arranged marriage. And did she really have a problem? Was her marriage really in trouble, or was it really the story of her marriage that was causing her so much angst?
Okay, I have to stop down, because for those people who are not stop down as in stop recording, I have to stop you to ask a question.
Yeah, of course.
For the people who are watching at home who are not memoir writers or nonfiction writers, I want to clarify, this is a memoir. This is nonfiction. Even though you just slipped into, which is common for memoir writers and nonfiction writers, you just slipped into her, the person you wrote about as a character. Yes, can you talk to some of my people at home about that, who are not writers themselves, who don't understand that process?
Yes, absolutely. In order to write memoir, there is this funny separation that we do. Our narrator, who is ourself, we treat her as a protagonist who still has to follow the conventions of the story arc. And we still abide by the conventions of making our parents and our loved ones and any other character in our book, we have to develop them like characters. We have to think of them like characters. We have to make sure we're, balancing out how we write them, that we're giving you kind of all these sides about it. And I think it's what actually makes the work of memoir possible. You know, people will always want to know, how can you write about something that's so personal? And there is this separation, you know, over the years, there's this difference. It's not a confessional. You know, I have not disclosed my entire life to you. I've disclosed what's relevant to the story I'm trying to tell.
It's just so interesting. And I do think it would help me reveal parts of myself if I separated the person I was writing about as a character out. Because it does have to be daunting to put this much of your personal life and your marriage and your family out into the world. How did that go for you? How did your family react? How did your husband react?
Oh my goodness. This is totally a story with a before and after, right? And I'm glad to say it does have a happy ending. But before this book came out, the mindset that I was in, the place that I was in with doing this work was extremely tortured. I felt so much guilt and shame for choosing to tell the story. I had come into this, my background, my training was in history. I'd actually thought I was going to be a historian. That's something I wrote about a little bit in the memoir, how I had planned on being an academic. And, you know, and I got into writing this personal, very personal story. I felt so much guilt and shame. I kept asking myself, why couldn't you have chosen a better topic, a safer topic, something you could have been proud of, something that you wouldn't have been embarrassed to tell people about? And I was just as creative as I was writing the book. I was creative in imagining these terrible consequences. You know, I pictured my in-laws disowning me. I pictured that I would not be able to show my face at school, at the pickup and drop-off line. I pictured that I would not be able to go to our community center, our mosques anymore. I even pictured people gossiping about my children and maybe in the future not wanting to marry into our family because their mother is this, you know, artist who's done this thing, who just trespassed all these social boundaries, wrote this very taboo book. And, you know, in hindsight, coming back to look at it now that my book has come out, I often wonder if a little bit of that was me assigning characters to this terrible fear I had about doing this really personal thing. You know, like almost like a way to disembody this fear that would have otherwise crippled me from writing the story and kind of assigning it all these blame and all these characters. It's like, oh, well, I will have troubles with my in-laws if I write this. I will have trouble with my community if I write this. And I like to share that because I know that other memoirists are telling themselves the story all the time. And I just want them to like, watch out. Like if you're doing that thing where you're assigning all these faces to this people who would make it impossible for you to write this book, maybe not so much. Maybe that's a little bit of your own fear speaking through them, because what has been the case, what has happened is that all those disastrous things that I thought were going to happen did not happen. And what I could not have imagined is that there's some legitimacy to having written a book that, you know, people understood, people got, even my closest family members got.
That's really nice, because I'm thinking about part of your book to me was about like dashed expectations of what love was supposed to be, of this like ideal like American picture of you're supposed to be madly in love. And this is like the experience with the book is almost like the opposite. You had these low expectations that were beat.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, the biggest shame I have felt has not been for writing the book, but for how I imagined my family would behave and my community would behave. That I could not give them the benefit of the doubt that they are also writers, and that they also have an understanding of story and of text and a desire to see themselves in story and text, and that they possibly could suspend belief for a moment that I was their niece or their daughter-in-law when they were reading this book and see me as a character and even see themselves in it. You know, I have been shocked by it was kind of my mom's generation that I was afraid of wagging the finger at me most, right? How dare you? You were so, you reveal these intimate details of your life. And I've had the opposite experience. And I've connected with my mom's generation in a way I never thought possible, where, somebody will pull me aside at a party and whisper into my ear and say, I saw my younger self in you. And I've been touched and moved by this, and emboldened and brave, made brave by it. Like I feel that I can own this identity of writer. I feel braver for future stories that I might tell.
Because that's amazing. I love that. And I was thinking about, this book is like a women's book club of women sitting around, talking about these moments in their lives when they felt, out of place and unsure of themselves and struggling with what love means and what marriage means and how do I live up to those expectations. What were you hoping to communicate through this book on that front to other women, whether they're in a marriage set up by their parents or a matchmaker or not?
Absolutely. I really did want to normalize a certain amount of relationship angst. I feel like the one thing that both cultures could agree on was that your newlywed years and the beginning of your relationship is supposed to be the happiest time of your life. And it's not. It's just really not for a lot of people. And where does that leave us when every message you're supposed to be getting is that you should be happier than this? Well, that means there's something wrong with us. That means there's something wrong with our relationship. And then where does that leave you? Either you accept that you have this bad relationship or you leave, or, and there's no space, there's no model, there's not enough stories of the muddling through. What does the muddling through look like? And that was really one of the reasons that actually compelled me to write Memoir. As painful as it was, and as difficult as it was to share my personal life, I also wanted to be a poster child for this. I was kind of okay with that, right? Because if I wrote a fictional account, you could easily put it aside and be like, okay, that was the narrator's experience. But I was very okay with, the idea of my inbox is open now. Come and find me if you're having trouble. Like, I believed in this enough that I wanted to be a resource after this for people to talk about these things. And you brought up the book clubs. I mean, the book clubs have been like an author version of heaven on earth for me, because when I go to the book clubs, I think we'll get to talking about this later, but this was a long road for me. It took me a really long time to write this book and to get it out there. And I feel like all those years pay off because I see my purpose in action. And it's just that purpose that you outlined before, to hear other women open up and share their early relationship stories and the way that they struggled. That's what it was all about for me in the first place.
So when you wrote this, you did foresee maybe being asked about marriages and love and I mean, not necessarily having to become an expert in that field, but in a way, being able to weigh in on those kinds of relationships.
Absolutely, I did. Actually, when I came back from Mexico, which is where the book ends, I realized that it was the human stories and the human relationship elements that got me interested in history anyway. And what I really wanted to spend my life was in the muck of human relationships, and I ended up going back to school that year, and I took a year of marriage and family therapy courses, and I was planning to go back to become a therapist. But at the same time, I actually became a mom as well. And it made it difficult for me to go to school full time. My husband was training. He's a doctor now, but he wasn't then. And his schedule just wouldn't permit for both of us to be in a really, really busy place. And I had this thought that, I could take some of these principles and foundations and ideas and craft a story out of them. And so I was very conscious of certain marital concepts that I was trying to show throughout the book. And I was kind of writing towards them. And I literally had them in a list of like these nuggets that I wanted to show. And
you got obsessed enough with human relationships to go back and become like a marriage therapist, basically. I mean, I get that you didn't.
Right. I'm not a
Going
licensed
down that road.
therapist, but yeah, I read the books. I took some of the courses, the principles of it interested in me enough.
Tell me one thing that made you about relationships in marriage that got you so fascinated that you went back and take classes. What was the most interesting thing you found out in the book or not?
You know, for me, it was just the way that we narrate our own experience. And this is like the meta thing that I was doing in the book, was showing you how I was narrating my relationship. All the trouble we get into in our relationships is based on the story we tell about our relationships. And when I realized that my husband and I were always sharing the same physical space, but never the same mental space, it was a game changer for me. To realize all these moments where I was assigning so much meaning to what he did and didn't do, his interiority, the story he was telling about that moment was completely different than mine. And it's no wonder, you know, we were butting heads with each other, because his brain, his thoughts were completely different than mine. And I have so much empathy for my young self now and for his young self. And I look back on arguments we have and thought, oh my gosh, if only I had known him better, I would have known that things could not have been otherwise, right? Like this was just how it had to be. This is just, yeah.
Okay. So what are you writing next? Are you sticking in memoir? Are you moving to nonfiction? Are you going to fiction? What are your feelings about this? Since you have so many clearly well thought out thoughts about.
Oh, thank you. You know what? Actually, I am taking a break from memoir. It is tough work. It is tough work. I've compared it, you know, I was talking to some other friends, how it feels like you're just carving something out of stone, which goes with the work you do. You know, like the rock is already there. You have to work with the rock that's there. And you have to chip the story out with the lived events that are already there. So it's up to you, the author, to sit there. It's a very like thought heavy process to sit there and think and tease out, where was the meaning? What was the truth in this rock, right? And to try and craft it into something. So after the book came out, I took a little break and wrote a middle grade story for this collection. It's called Once Upon an Aid. It's coming out in May. This is a collection of 15 authors. They're writing joyous, young, middle grade stories about, you know, the Muslim holiday. This is going to come out after Ramadan, or during Ramadan, actually, leading up to Eid. And I loved it. I loved taking this little break to write something that was fun, creative. The characters were invented, and it inspired me. Now, what I am working on is a middle grade story.
Really? So you're going the youth. That's so hard to me, because you have to simplify everything. You got to boil it down.
But you know what I realized too? The thing that fascinated me with the memoir is still there, even in the middle grade. It's all about the emotional nugget for me, the emotional truth. And the book I'm working on now, I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. It's just in its very early stages. I was a Muslim girl in a Catholic school. And so I'm trying to tell that story through this fictionalized story this time. It's not my real story this time. But, you know, I wanted to write an interfaith story for young readers, because I think, you know, most of our actual religious education often starts when when we're like 12, 13, 14. It's very rare that you find teenagers still going to Sunday school, right? And so our understanding of our faith can sometimes stay crystallized in this very early stage, right? And I think that can lead to trouble later on, where we haven't come to have like a nuanced understanding of religion, how religion operates in society. So I'm trying to show some things with this book, and I haven't gotten there yet. I haven't gotten to the chapters where I'm showing those things, but that's what's interesting me about the story. That's what I'm trying to do with it.
What's interesting about that is it's coming at a time when I feel like our culture is we're facing more of the multiculturalism in our communities, and we're trying to understand that more, and we're trying to accept that people come from different
places, right?
Yes, and you certainly have that story, Iraqi-American. We talked a lot about the relationships, but the other thing this book is it is about this mix of cultures.
Sure.
How have you seen that change over the course of your life?
You know, one thing that I wanted to do with this book, you know, talking about that history background, another thing that I was thinking about as I was doing this was that I was essentially trying to write a primary source for a girl who had grown up in 1980s, 1990s California, because immigration has changed so much and continues to change so much. And I don't think we're ever going to see a wave of immigration like what my parents went through, and maybe a few generations after. The isolation that they experienced because of technology, just of where technology was, it made the experience of coming to another country completely different. You know, I mean, I remember when my parents first got here, it was a really special occasion to make the long distance call, right? They used to send those little airmail letters. And how often were you going to send those? And then it was like the phone call could cost them their mortgage some months. You know, there would be these terrible months where somebody had like an impulse to call and ended up talking too long, and then the bill would come. I remember when the phone bill would come, it was like this big crisis in the household, like it's $500 this month. And we're talking about like in the 80s, you know, that was a lot of money. That has completely changed now. Mother is more connected to her family abroad than she's ever been. We have WhatsApp. We have all this video conferencing. My mom has been doing Zoom calls during this pandemic with all her brothers and sisters. We are more connected than we've ever been. We are watching YouTube live from, you know, our countries of origin. And the way that's changed things is that when I was growing up, we had such little information about the society that we came from. We were kind of making it up. Mm-hmm. And things got frozen and we didn't modernize. You know, in the early 2000s, I was living in Ohio, and there was a lot of Iraqi refugees coming from the Iraq War. And it was my first time being the one who was being friends with the people who were newly arriving. And it was my first time where they were my age and they were my peers. And they laughed at me. They laughed at my story. They laughed at the way I was raised. They laughed at the customs that we still held on to. And they said, you lived in an Iraq that doesn't exist anymore. You know, you grew up with ideas that have changed completely.
That's fascinating. It is fascinating how much has changed over the course of our lifetimes culturally with different cultures coming together.
Right.
And now we're living through another giant change in our relationships in our life with this pandemic and this quarantine. You were so honest in your memoir. I'm wondering how it is being quarantined with the family and the husband and how you're coping with all of that, because we're all coping with being locked in rooms with people we love, but you know, the love only goes so far.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I feel so much empathy for everyone right now. My situation is a little different because my husband is still in the medical field. So he is still working. You know, he's going to work every day. And there's two layers to this. One is the normalcy it affords my family. I am actually really grateful on one level that we have this normal routine that is just built into place just by virtue of him going to work. He leaves in the morning, he comes back in the afternoon. And I am grateful also that his specialty is not on the front line of all this.
That's what I was going to ask. What is it?
So it's a little bit like I'm worried, but my stakes are a little bit lower. But that is the other part, though, that is oddly working for us, because I am worried. I am worried about him. And, you know, there's nothing like, you know, fear and concern and the notion of scarcity to make you love your spouse, right? Every morning when he leaves, I'm like, oh my gosh, be careful out there, come home safe. But on the other hand, like, I have been texting and calling and reaching out to all my friends who are in a different situation with their spouses. And I keep telling everybody, please don't make any decisions about your relationship right now. Don't make any decisions, right? Marriages are a delicate balance of how much is too much time together and how much is too little. We walk a fine line. We're always walking this fine line. And we have good seasons and we have bad seasons. And this can be a really bad season for our relationship. And relationships are also very, very, very vulnerable to our circumstances. So if you're under any financial stress right now, that's going to be disaster for a relationship. Mm-hmm. If your house is too small, that is going to be disaster for a relationship. You know, I think of other chapters in our life where we've lived in, you know, 1-bedroom apartments, 2-bedroom apartments. These things have to be taken into account. We have to talk about it. We have to think about it. You know, because I'm afraid, because my husband's leaving every day, my balance is in a different place right now, but I know that's not the case for so many of my friends. And, you know, the biggest piece that I keep trying to relay to my friends in all of this is be careful of your narrator. Now is not the time to tell the story of your relationship, to tell the story of your past in light of the circumstances we're currently in, right?
That is excellent advice. Before I follow up on that though, what specialty is your husband in? What is he doing during this? And how is he coping? And is he coming home and having to like strip down and bathe it all off before he comes in the house? Just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, you know, it's funny, not funny actually, is really, really sad, is my husband did 2 specialties. So his first specialty was actually in internal medicine at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, the epicenter of the epicenter. So those stories coming out of Elmhurst feel really close to home because I can see myself there at another chapter in our life. He would have been one of those frontline workers with 2 small children at home in a little tiny apartment in Queens. I honestly do not know what we would have done or how we would have gotten through it. I don't know where he would have hid in the apartment. That community is small. Spaces are small. We're all living on top of one another. And you can see how the disease spread so easily there. Yeah. So in one chapter in our life, this would have touched us very, very, very closely. Since then, my husband decided to do, right after he finished at Elmhurst in Queens, he took on another specialty, which took us to that little chapter in Ohio I was telling you about, where he trained in physical medicine and rehabilitation, which is one of the lesser known specialties, but they help with things like traumatic brain injuries, strokes. He works a lot with amputees, and he loves his work, but it is not on the front lines of pandemic care.
One other thing on this front, how is this pandemic and this quarantine time affecting your creativity and your writing and all of that?
It's taken a real toll, because I consider myself a school year writer. I have 3 children. They're older now, but that's my school day structure, is my writing day. I would do all my writing from when I dropped everybody off at school till when they got home. So my writing day happened between the hours of like 9 and 2 o'clock. And that structure is gone for me. And I had plans of how I was going to use these last few months before school let out. And I know I don't get a lot of work done during summer. So now we're going to go from this into the summer. And so I've had to rely on what I've had to rely on in many stages in my writing life, is just to accept that it's about the persistence rather than the necessarily the showing up every day. I don't show up to my writing desk every day, but I have 2 women that I've been writing with for the last, 13 years now, and we're accountability partners with each other. And so they're the ones who are getting me jump started on this project that I told you about. And if it wasn't for them, I probably would be doing no new pages. But I'm trying to do 10 pages a week for them. But what that looks like is we meet on Saturday, and Thursday and Friday night, I basically stay up until 2 in the morning trying to, get out these 10 pages, and they're not very good. I know they're not what I normally show anybody, not even my writing partners, but it's forcing me to do something. So I think like, if there's any tips that I would come away with, is that trying to lower your standards a little bit for what getting work done looks like, that whatever it is on the page is worth something, and that, if it's just a matter of keeping yourself in the game, even if you don't write every day, just that you don't despair that this means that you've lost who you are as a writer. This is something we can always come back to, and it's always there for us, even if there's seasons when we don't work, which I've always had. I've always had seasons where I don't work. I've had a newborn at home. I always take summers off. I usually don't try to produce much during the summers because kids are home. So
I could keep talking to you for a long, because this has just been fascinating. I've loved picking your brain about all of this, but I have kept you a very long time. So I'm going to say goodbye for now, but I look forward when you have more books out and more things up for us reconvening and having another one of these conversations and seeing you again on the road too.
I'd love that. It's always a pleasure to see you on the road. I love you in person and I love you from afar. This has been so much fun for me. Thank you for having me.
Good. And everybody now gets to read the book. And the title has been over your head the whole conversation.
Yes.
I just love First Comes.
This is my book tour poster that has found a home in my dining room / office. This is where we are, is my dining room table right now.
I love that. I love that. Well, it's just
Stephanie
perfect.
Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Story.